Hey, faithful listener, grab your cup of coffee and experience the Bible in a way you never have before. P40 Ministries is a podcast that goes through the Bible cover to cover. It's an awesome narrative that focuses your mind and prepares your heart for God to speak. So join your host, Jenn, for a biblical podcast that's hilarious, informative, imaginative, and fun. The P40 Ministries podcast. Listen now as we go through the book of Leviticus. Hello, happy Monday, friends and faithful listeners. This is Jenn with the P40 Ministries podcast. Thanks for tuning in this morning to talk about Leviticus chapter, 7, verses 22 through 27. I'm excited about this chapter because, or I should say this portion, because it's something that I really enjoy, which is talking about health. I mean, health, I wouldn't say I'm like super passionate about health, but I do enjoy talking about it. It's kind of fun. And this is talking all about eating fat and the fat of animals and stuff like that, and why God commands us not to eat it, which is kind of interesting. And hopefully I present you guys a fun episode today that you guys will enjoy about fats and different kinds of fats. So yeah, let's go ahead and see what this is all about and read this. I will be talking about this in the WEB version today, as I literally always do. But please feel free to read out of the versions you prefer to read out of. And yeah, so let's grab those cups of coffee and let's go ahead and read. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, You shall eat no fat of bull or sheep or goat. The fat of that which dies of itself and the fat of that which is torn out of animals may be used for any other service, but you shall in no way eat of it. For whoever eats the fat of the animal which men offer as an offering made by fire to Yahweh, even the soul who eats of it shall be cut off from his people. You shall not eat any blood, whether it is of bird or of animal, in any of your dwellings. Whoever it is who eats any blood, that soul shall be cut off from his people." So I'm just going to start out right away by saying, first and foremost, Jesus made foods clean in the New Testament when he said that, a food cannot make us unclean, but it's from what the heart does that makes us unclean. Now, that being said, I personally still don't believe that we should drink blood, because even Paul in the New Testament, and I believe, who else was it? I can't remember, but I believe there were two people in the New Testament that specifically continued to say, do not drink blood. I'm still under the belief that because the New Testament continually reiterated the drinking of blood was dangerous, that we should not drink blood. And I mean, blood carries so many diseases. I was actually laughing recently because I was watching this show called Alone in the Arctic. It's like a competition survival show or whatever. And there was one guy on it who was really, really interesting. He started like drinking the squirrel's blood on the TV. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so gross. Like, I was truly just grossed out by it. I was like, ugh. And then there was like this little blip in the corner where they will like, the people who edit the show will like put little tips and stuff like in the corner. And the tip was, please do not drink animal blood. It causes many diseases. And then it lists like all these diseases. And it was just really interesting. But yeah, I mean, modern science tells us that drinking blood is literally very unhealthy. In fact, blood has a tendency to, cause many, many different illnesses. Lots of stuff is transmitted through blood, if not probably most diseases are transmitted through blood. So yeah, in my opinion, blood is something we shouldn't mess with, especially when it comes to like eating it or drinking it. I don't know. I truly still believe that drinking or eating blood is still not good, not healthy, but I don't believe most people drink blood. So I think we're good. But yeah, I mean, God is pretty clear here as to why we should not drink blood. But fat, on the other hand, is something that is so debated. Should we eat fat? Should we not eat fat? Why does God say not to eat fat? Isn't animal fat good for you? I mean, there's so many questions. And even I had these questions when I first started learning about fat, because we often hear that you need fat to survive. Like, fat is something that you eat in order to survive. It is energy for the human being to consume fat. But here is where the confusion starts, because when God tells us not to eat fat, he's referring to two very specific types of fat. And there are 3 Hebrew words, I believe, for fat mentioned in the Old Testament. So one of the Hebrew words, and I can't remember any of them, I'm very sorry, but one of them meant the fat that is found on the insides of the animal, which would be tough kind of fats, like hard fats. The second kind of fat would be the softer fats found on the animal, such as the tail fat that we read about, where God's like, don't eat the fat on the tail. And then the third kind of fat that we see in the Old Testament is the fats that God allows the people to eat. And in fact, there's even a verse, I believe in Genesis, that we covered where God is saying that his people are going to eat of the fat of the land. And so when we see verses like that, people are like, oh, that's a contradiction because God tells the people not to eat fat. Well, no, it's because the Hebrew words are all different. And unfortunately, in English, we only have one word for fat, which is fat. But God is specifically talking about specific kinds of fats that his people were not allowed to eat. So let's talk about these a little bit. And let me just tell you, I think I mentioned this on Friday. I'm like ready to change my entire diet based on the research I found with fats today. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about some of these. So one thing I was just so concerned about, though, when I first started reading, like, God tells his people not to eat animal-based fats, I was like, how though? How could they survive in the wilderness without eating animal-based fats? And I was very confused by this because I enjoy researching about survival and stuff like that. And one of the big things is you have to eat fat in order to survive, because fat is energy. It's stored energy. So we need energy in order to survive. And so the more fat you can get, the better. And so I'm like, how could a group of people in the wilderness survive without eating animal-based fats? Like, why would God tell his people not to eat that stuff? So this confused me. But then, like, as I was reading about animal-based fats, I can totally understand now why God didn't have his people eat them. First and foremost, the people of Israel had fat. They had that fat that is mentioned as a fat that you could eat. They had it in milk. I mean, just remember how much milk these people had, because they had goats, they had sheep, they probably had cows. They had plenty of milk. Milk is a fat. We know that because sometimes we buy fat-free milk, right? Because it's supposedly healthier, because it has less fat in it. Butter, they had butter. They had those kinds of fats, like dairy-based fats. They might have had eggs. They might have. So they probably had those kinds of fats. And then on top of that, don't forget that they had oils. They had possibly olives. They had plant-based fats as well, which are all fantastic fats. And in fact, nowadays, we consider plant-based fats as healthy fats. When I think of a healthy fat, I always think of an avocado. So that is a healthy fat that doctors tell us nowadays to consume, which is the plant-based fats. So as I was reading more about this stuff, I first looked into the healthy fats that God tells his people to eat, which is the milk and the plant-based fats. And I found out that they are so, so healthy for you. And even though, doctors in the 80s told people not to eat butter because it was super fatty, we are now finding out that butter is actually pretty good for you. The substitute for butter in the 80s was margarine. And doctors were like, eat margarine because it's low fat and it's good for you and it's going to help you lose weight. And then nowadays, we find out that margarine is filled, absolutely filled with trans fat, which is extremely unhealthy. So that made me start researching trans fat, which is like an artificial fat that the human body literally cannot process. Like it clogs us up. And that was what people were consuming in the 80s. And I read that trans fat, which is found even nowadays, though it's not artificial, it's still bad for you. Trans fat is found largely in frozen pizzas, which is something I consume on like a daily basis. My husband and I make frozen pizzas all the time. And now I'm just like, okay, I don't want to eat frozen pizzas anymore because they are loaded with trans fat. And in fact, when you consume trans fat, I found out that you have a 21% higher risk of heart attack than if you didn't. Trans fats are just awful for people to eat. And doctors are finding out more and more how bad trans fats really are. And so that obviously is an unhealthy fat that we shouldn't be consuming. But, going back to the plant-based fats, those are called monounsaturated fats. And that is what we consider to be the healthy fats, the good fats, the fats that you can find in nuts and in avocados and in olive oil and olives. Those are all fantastic fats for people to eat and to consume. But, people could argue like, oh, well, there's also animal-based fats that are monounsaturated. But let me just find this article I read on Harvard, which is just absolutely fascinating. And so this is the Harvard Health Medical School, and they did some research on 90,000 different people on plant-based fats and animal-based fats. Both of these, just remember, some animal fats are in fact monounsaturated fats and would be considered quote-unquote good for you. But this is where I'm finding out there's a reason God told his people not to eat animal-based fats. So here's what it says here on Harvard, and this was published in 2018. It says, but the source of the fat appears to make a difference. That's according to the researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, who studied dietary data from more than 90,000 people over an average of 22 years. Heart disease risk was lower when unhealthy saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, or trans fat was replaced by plant-based monounsaturated fat, but not by animal-based monounsaturated fat. Higher intake of the plant-based fats was associated with 16% lower risk of dying from any cause. In contrast, higher intake of the animal-based fats was linked to a 21% higher risk of dying from any cause. When I read that, I was stunned. Like, modern medical science now tells us that animal-based fats, the stuff that God told his people not to eat thousands of years ago, we are just finding out why now, only a few years ago, because this fat is bad for you. It increases your risk of dying from any cause by 21%. Animal-based monounsaturated fats are just not good for people. Wow, this just shows the truth of the Bible and how when God says to eat healthy fats, like the stuff found in plant-based stuff, like the fat found there, God was telling this stuff for a reason to his people. He was literally prolonging their lives. Literally prolonging their lives. And did the people know that back then? No. In fact, they probably were angry that they couldn't eat the delicacy of the fats on the animals. Like, for example, I mentioned a while back that tail fat, They would actually breed their animals back in those days to have fatter and fatter tails, because that was considered like a filet mignon for them. That was a delicacy, and they wanted to eat that fat tail. But God specifically says, don't eat that fat tail. It's not good for you. Don't eat the fat. And so the people maybe back then were just like, why can't we eat the fat? Well, it was bad for them. It was bad for their heart health. It was not good for them. And so then even the hard fats that I talked about briefly in this episode that are found inside the animal, those weren't good for people either, because those had a tendency to breed tapeworms and stuff. That stuff wasn't good for you. So this is just fascinating to me that God, back in those days, was telling people how to live a very healthy and meaningful life. And just now, only a handful of years ago, we're finally finding out how good some fats are for us and how bad other fats are for us. Like, for example, trans fat was only just recently banned. Like, artificial trans fat was just banned only a handful of years ago. Modern science is just helping us discover these truths of the Old Testament more and more and more. Just with simple things like, don't eat fat on animals. Don't eat bad fats. But like, even going to the milk kind of fats, which are considered saturated fats, we're finding out that healthy saturated fats are not bad for you, and stuff like milk have vitamin D in it. I mean, milk-based products are pretty good for you if you can handle lactose. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It's a little different. I didn't really talk about the Bible too much in this one, but man, I mean, this stuff needs to be told. Like, the truth of the Old Testament and just the truth of what God was doing for his people back in these days. And, you know, we're finding out about it. And I just think that's really interesting. But anyway, friends and faithful listeners, I don't know if this convicted you to change your diet or not. You know, because, man, the American diet, not super healthy. Because we consume all sorts of nasty kinds of fats. But yeah, I mean, I'm not one to talk. I'm always eating store-bought cookies and Oreos and whatever else. That probably isn't good for you. But anyway, faithful listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and definitely join me tomorrow for an episode out of Mark. That will be very interesting, as we're finishing up the book of Mark very soon here and talking about Jesus' resurrection in the next coming days. So join me for that, 6 a.m. or whenever you wake up. But guys, happy listening, and God bless.